Greetings and welcome to the Global Consciousness Summit 1.0. I'm Dr. James V. Hardt, and I'm here today to do a teaching about Kundalini and the brainwaves of awakening. By using the cartography of consciousness to create partial differential psychophysiological surfaces for mapping and altering human mind states, we can win this quest and learn how to raise our Kundalini. This image is suggestive of the fact that the Kundalini, when it reaches the crown chakra, the seventh chakra, lights up the brain. Many times if you see a painting or a statue of a Buddha, you will see what looks like flower petals, like wearing a crown of flower petals. That's to indicate that when the Kundalini hits the brain, it awakens the seventh chakra into what they call the 1,000-petaled lotus. So let this image be indicative, suggestive of the enormous mind powers that are available when the energy of the Kundalini ascending up the spine reaches all the way to the brain, to the seventh chakra. We are going to look at the brain waves of Kundalini. Our goal, of course, is to awaken the global mind. Here are the brain waves, the first ever scientifically recorded of somebody having a Kundalini awakening. And the picture on the left shows, illustrates this enormous energy coming up the spine. And we'll see some more pictures, picture being worth 1,000 words, and words actually being not very useful in describing the Kundalini. The mystical experience, you might recall, is known by 5 hallmarks, which are: 1, intense sensation, unusual sensations, transsensate phenomena that come from beyond the realm of the 5 senses, the experience of unity or oneness, and the 5th one is ineffability, which means ineffable is unable to be described in words. Now, what you see here are brain waves. At the bottom are the frontals, 2 left and right, F3, F4. Above that are the temporals, T3, T4. Above that are the centrals, C3 and C4. And then at the top are the occipitals, O1 and O2. So this is the back of the head at the top and the front of the head at the bottom. The most powerful delta waves, and you know they're delta waves because here you can see the 1-second tick marks on the polygraph that was recording this amazing event. And you can see that their delta is between 0 and 4 cycles per second. The logo of the Biocybernaut Institute is a torus, indicative of halos. It's nearly a phi ratio torus. And why I'm a biocybernaut? Well, a biocybernaut is to inner space what an astronaut is to outer space. Naut is a Greek suffix indicating somebody who goes on an adventure, like Jason and the Argonauts went off in search of the golden fleece, which was how Jason was to win the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. Now, here are the samples of the different brainwaves. You can see delta, which is 0 to 4. Now, we know that delta is actually not a monolith. There's low delta, 0 to 2, and high delta, 2 to 4, which have actually different generators in the brain. Then you see theta waves, which are 4 to 7 hertz. Then there's a gap. Alpha starts at 8 and goes to 13. Now, we actually at Biocybernaut, we know that although going back from the dawn of brainwaves, which were discovered in 1908 by Herr Dr. Hans Berger, an Austrian psychiatrist, and first published in 1918. From then up until mid-1950s, there were no brainwaves seen in the recordings between 7 and 8 hertz. It was a gap. We have some theories about that, but we record brainwaves in that gap. Now we call them Schumann brainwaves because the Schumann resonance frequency of the Earth is about 7.83 hertz. But that's a topic for another talk. Anyway, alpha begins at 8, goes to 13. Beta goes 13 to 30, and from there on up is gamma. And we may be able to go above that a little bit in something that we would call chirp. They're up, maybe up to 120 or 30. Okay, Kundalini, the power of the force. Learn the way of the delta force. And here we have the illustrative slide that indicates this amazing energy coiling up the spine, awakening each chakra as it passes through, and the amazing brainwaves on the right, which before 1988, when I recorded this, I had never seen. Now, any topic as profound as Kundalini, we probably at least need to give a nod in the direction of Wikipedia. Kundalini is described as a sleeping dormant potential force in the human organism. It is one of the components of an esoteric description of the subtle body, which consists of nadis, energy channels, some of which run up the spine, chakras, which are psychic energy centers, prana, which is subtle energy, and bindu, which are drops of essence. And here you see the 7 typical chakras depicted. There are higher chakras, but we have the base chakra, second chakra, third, fourth, which is Hardt, fifth, sixth, and then the crown chakra. Now, I should also mention, I'm going to show you some pictures that are illustrative of the magic that people experience when they're having a Kundalini awakening. Here you see again the 7 chakras. This is even more powerful, showing the toroidal fields. Possibly we could bring in Drunvalo Melchizedek, and he could talk about the counter-rotating tetrahedrons, which give rise to generating the Merkaba field. And here we see an illustration of the energy coiling up from the base of the spine to the crown chakra. I like this one because it indicates the explosion of consciousness, violet, at a very high frequency when the Kundalini energy hits the brain. Now, it's appropriate, I think, to mention Ram Dass's description of the Kundalini. He said, now this is according to the tradition in India. There is described inside the body, between the genitals and the anus, a lingam, around which is coiled 3.5 times a snake. That's a symbol of the Kundalini energy, the Kundalini serpent. And when the snake lifts its head, when you're about to have a Kundalini awakening, snake lifts its head and it ascends up the nadis, the subtle channels, the Ida and the Pingala, which run up the spine. And Ram Dass described how as it passes through each chakra, it awakens that chakra into super conscious beingness. And at one point, Ramana Maharshi, a famous illuminated master in India, was trying to tell his followers about the Kundalini. And he's saying, okay, now you bring it up to the first chakra, and then he described what it felt like. And then you bring it up to the second chakra, the sexual chakra, you describe what that felt like. Then you bring it up to the third chakra, the center of ego and will, and you describe what it felt like. And then he brought it up to his heart chakra, and he couldn't talk. And so he'd gone into a superconscious state. It's the first superconscious state when the Kundalini rises, when it hits the fourth chakra. And so he went back down, and then, well, what I was trying to say, and he brought it up to the fourth chakra, and again, he became speechless. And he tried this multiple times. Finally, he's in tears, and he says to his followers, well, I really want to tell you, but the Divine Mother keeps sealing my lips, and I cannot put it into words. One interesting historical footnote, everybody is familiar with the Sphinx in Egypt. Well, initially, the Sphinx had a cobra head on the forehead, which was indicative, suggestive of their awareness of the Kundalini energy. And at one point, when the French army was in Egypt, they used the Sphinx as target practice for their artillery, and they blasted the face of the Sphinx and destroyed the cobra head that was indicative of the Kundalini energy in the Sphinx. Okay, now here are the initials of the man who in 1988 demonstrated for me and for the first time for the scientific world, the brainwaves of Kundalini. This is a slide that I showed you before with the colored energy coming up the spine. And here you see the head sides. Back of the head, O1, O2. Top of the head, C3, C4. Side of the head, T3, T4. And the front of the head, the frontals, F3 and F4. The 1 second marks across the top on the polygraph paper. This was an ink writing polygraph in those days. Now we have electronic polygraphs. And you can see the massive bursts of delta. I had never seen this before. I had been doing this work for 17 years. The first formal academic study I ran of 20 college students, trained them 7 days with alpha training, was in 1971. And this is 1988, and I had never seen this pattern before. Here are some additional from JH. Now, this scruff of blackness is muscle tension, which indicates that sometimes before he would go into the Kundalini experience, whole body would twitch like that. And it would produce this big burst of very fast frequency, high amplitude muscle tension. Now this was my lab assistant, Maureen Sansing at the time. She had never seen this before. She'd been with me for 7 or 8 years at this time and had never seen anything like this before. Big bursts of synchronous delta, particularly on the frontals and centrals. Here we see a tighter burst. You can see they can be only a few seconds. Here is a longer burst. And here he had a muscle twitch before the Kundalini rose. That's the blackness across the screen. And when the experience was over, he had a second muscle twitch. Here we see bursts of delta activity. Oh, what happened here? This is a marker. He's doing an alpha feedback training, and this is his 3rd day. And so during the 8 seconds that the feedback tones shut down and the scores come up, the marker line would look like this. So when shortly, within a second or so of the alpha feedback tone stopping, he went out of the delta, probably opened his eyes, looked at the scores. This might be like an eye blink right here. And then when the scores went out, the room was dark again, the feedback tones came back on, he went right back into this experience. Here's another longer burst, and there's a very long burst. Now, it's appropriate for me to share a little of the backstory about this. This man had first called me when he was in the company of a Zen master. And the two of them were talking about coming for training together. In the end, that particular Zen master did not come. I had trained other Zen masters, but this one didn't come. And so JH came by himself. Now, he had a very interesting story. He was on a 3-year paid leave of absence from IBM with no requirement to go back. And so I got, and he was, shall we say, an unimposing fellow. He was small, bird-like, self-effacing. In a crowd of 2, you would not notice him. When at the end of this day, because I'd never seen this before, I looked through the polygraph records. We would flip through every page of the paper polygraph, and I would ask him, like, well, what is this? I've never seen this before. And he'd go, oh, I don't know. And so I got a little further into his story. It turned out that he had begun his career with IBM as a mid-level clerk in Marseille, France. And one hot summer day, there was one of those horrific traffic jams in Marseille, 6-hour traffic jams, where the French blow their horns until the batteries run down on their cars. And then they get out and they yell and swear and fight, in French. And in this, he's trapped in this. the heat and the cacophony, the shouting, the fighting. And in the midst of this, he had his first ever out-of-body experience. And he was flying around over the massed jammed cars, swooping down energetically and stopping fights. And eventually the tow trucks came, and after 6 hours, they pulled the cars away from the outer edge, finally cleared the city center. Well, the next day, JH is back at work, and but he's altered now. And to the credit of his IBM managers, he's now given a new job because he has new skills. Because guess what? He has new brainwaves. Okay, what's his job? Well, best to describe it is, let's say that IBM wants to build a new plant in Marseille, let's say in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And the first thing they do is they send a highly paid team of experts there to scout the territory, to look at properties, find out, if there's enough electrical power, is there sewage and water, is there transportation, are they near population hubs, will they be able to get the workers to and from the plant? So then they have some candidate sites and they leave. Then another highly paid team of experts go in and they negotiate to buy the land. Maybe they have to pay some bribes to, local officials under the table, but they pick a site, they buy it, and then they leave. And then another highly paid team of experts goes and they contract with the builders, the construction companies. Now, some of them stay on site to make sure that the builders don't cheat and substitute 1/8-inch steel where 1/4-inch steel was specified. And so when the construction is nearing its end, another team of highly paid people go there and they start advertising and recruiting for the workers. And a subset of this team will hire and interview and hire the managers for the plant. And so when all is said and done, way over budget in money and way over budget in time, here's the completed plant. Power and water and resources, materials, workers are flowing in. The factory is going crunch, 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 and the product is going out the door and IBM is going ka-ching. But there were a lot of highly paid teams of people and it was over budget in time and money. Well, what IBM found, and I can't tell you how they found this, they could dispense with all those highly paid teams of people and just send JH. And JH in some way that nobody understood, and it actually took me a while after I saw these brainwaves, for me to understand, I discovered that JH could go there and he could perform all these functions all by himself and deliver the finished plant under budget in time and way under budget in money. And so when JH went to his manager and said, I'm leaving, I'm resigning, the manager went, well, no, you can't resign. You probably just need a leave of absence. We'll give you a 1-year leave of absence. And JH goes, no, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. And so his manager goes, well, how about we give you a 2-year leave of absence? JH goes, no, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. The manager goes, how about a 3-year leave of absence? JH goes, no, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. And the manager just at wit's end goes, how about we give you a 3-year leave of absence and you don't have to promise to come back? And JH goes, okay, I'll do that. And so there he was when he showed up at Biocybernaut in 1988, ready to do his Alpha 1 training. He was on a 3-year paid leave of absence of IBM with no requirement to return. Well, as you can see up here in the top line, his occipital alpha, where people typically have their biggest alpha, there's a little burst right there, a little bit here, a little bit here. It's nothing to write home to mother about. So I've been wondering for the first 3 days of his training, what does JH have that IBM is willing to pay 3 years salary in the hope that he might decide to come back? Spectacular Kundalini. I had been doing the Yogananda lessons since 1971, so I was deeply imbued. I'd been initiated into Kriya Yoga by one of Yogananda's direct disciples, And so I knew a lot about Kundalini. I'd never had a Kundalini experience, but here's another even slower, very, very slow delta waves from JH. And then here's another big burst. Then he kind of comes out of it, has a big alpha burst, and then he goes back into it. Here's a long, extended, beautiful burst of high amplitude delta on 6 of his EEG channels, biggest on the frontals, which I say is the natural home of alpha, of delta. Now you can see here, you know, this is his alpha activity. And like I said, it's nothing to write home to mother about. It's definitely not in the league of a Zen master or an advanced Zen, but this delta is phenomenal. There's another burst of delta, another big, long, beautiful burst. So now I want to share with you that I was mystified by this, and he was no help. In the day 3 interview at the end of his Alpha 1 training, he just looked at this and shrugged and didn't know what it was. So I said to Maureen, I said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. The chamber in which JH was training at the time had 16 speakers, 4 on the front wall for Alpha 1, and 4 on each side wall and 4 on the back wall. And at times I had as many as 8 people in this chamber doing shared feedback, where each person could have 2 channels of feedback. And so any one of the many channels could be routed to any of the speakers. So I said to Maureen, what we're going to do, we're going to take these 6 channels, left and right central, left and right temporal, and left and right frontal, and we're going to route the delta waves from these 6 channels to these other speakers that are not being used for his Alpha 1 training. And we're going to use the same amplitude as we're using for his alpha. You can see the amplitude of the alpha is like this. The amplitude of the delta is what? 2, 3, sometimes 4 times bigger than his alpha. And so if he ever does this again, like we're hoping he does it on day 4, he's going to get blasted. These sounds from the side and the back are going to rock the chamber. And of course, I'm going to tell him about it. So at the end of the day, if he ever does that again, I'm going to say, okay, now, what were you doing when those tones were blasting? So we tell him about this, and he goes in, he's doing his alpha. And fortunately, he did this again. And this, the floor plates, 2 of them in the chamber, each of them weigh 800 pounds. It has steel walls. It's a Faraday cage. And that thing was rocking from the blasting of the delta wave feedback that he was getting. So at the end of the session, I can hardly wait to open the door. Because we were going to do an interview. We didn't do video interviews. We did stereo audio interviews in those days. And I said, well, I sat down, turned on the tape recorder, and I go, okay, well, what was it? And he goes, well, what was what? And I go, well, when all those tones were blasted, you remember, we were looking at that yesterday. What's going on? He said, oh, well, that was when the Kundalini was coming up. And I go, Kundalini? You have Kundalini. Why didn't you tell me? And he goes, oh, well, I didn't think it was that important. And I didn't think you'd know what it was. And so this is how self-effacing this guy was. So I knew that we had recorded for the first time in the history of science, the brainwaves of Kundalini. This was absolutely fantastic. You can see as we go through, sometimes a big twitch of the body before he goes into this Kundalini as that energy rises up his spine. Look at this big, long, beautiful run of the brainwaves of Kundalini. Okay, so now while we enjoy this contemplative image, I would like to share with you, because I eventually, a few years later, maybe a year or 2 later, I had my own first Kundalini awakening. And I now know how it was that JH could accomplish the mission of teams of highly paid experts faster and cheaper than they could, and why he was so highly prized by IBM. So we fast forward, I'm now working with Foster Gamble, and we're using the Biocybernaut technology in a company called Mind Center. And we have a big training center in Palo Alto, California. And for the first time, Foster had persuaded me to begin to make theta trainings available to the public. And so a little aside there, I said, Foster, you have to understand that we're going to have to really caretake these people when they come out of the chamber, because they will not be ready to drive for some hours. And he goes, oh, well, what do you mean? I said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a theta training, and every night I'll follow you home. Well, the first and second nights were fine. The third night, I'm following Foster Gamble's car. We're in Palo Alto, and he lives in Woodside, so it's a bit of a drive. And so he stops at a red light, and I stop behind him. The light changes green. He continues to sit there. The light changes red and then turns green again, and he continues to sit there. The light changes red, and on the third time that it went green, he came out of his theta trance and proceeded to drive safely all the way home. And so in those days, we had a shorter protocol than we do now at Biocybernaut. Right now, for example, after their training, people go into an extended debriefing, and then we serve them dinner, and then we look at their graphs. And so it's hours after they're out of the chamber before they drive. But back then, we would confiscate their keys at the start of the day, their car keys. And outside our beautiful high-end center in Palo Alto, there were duck ponds and little grassy knolls with damp grass. And so we would have them take their shoes and socks off and walk in the damp grass to ground themselves. And then they would come back in, and I would look into their eyeballs. And only when their pupils had stopped being fantastically dilated would I give them their keys back so that they could drive home. So anyway, we're now leading theta trainings at the Mind Center in Palo Alto. And we had 4 chambers. One of them was empty in this particular training. So I elected to have the technicians put electrodes on me. So during the extended period of theta enhancement, I would go and lie down in the theta chair in the empty chamber, and I would do theta training. Well, on day 7 of this training, I had my first ever Kundalini awakening. And it was massive. It was an incredible energy pouring up my spine. It pushed everything, including my name, my identity, all my willpower, all my intentions, all pushed way out to the periphery. A metaphor might be if you've ever seen firefighters with one of the high pressure hoses fighting a big fire. It takes 3 strong men to hold the head of that hose. And if they were to let go, it would flap around like that. Well, that immense energy coming through the hose was the Kundalini energy coming up my spine. It was like a freight train coming up my spine. And everything that was me was pushed to the far, far outer periphery. Well, this profoundly changed me in ways that I'm still discovering. That was day 7 of the training. I have no idea how I got home to San Francisco that night. There I had 2 roommates, both of whom loved books and records. And I'd promised one of them, Tom Munch, that I would go with him to the Hong Kong restaurant on Church Street near Market the next day. Now, this was a dangerous thing for me to do because a few doors up the road was the Aardvark used bookstore. And I had this habit of buying lots of books, and I used to read a lot of books. When I was in 2nd grade, my dad made a strict rule that I was not allowed to read more than 24 books a week. And I would bring them home from the library. He'd count them to make sure there weren't more than 24. But of course, I would cheat. I would go to the library after school and read unauthorized books. So ever since 2nd grade, I had this habit of reading lots of books. Well, but at this time, I was running 2 companies, Biocybernaut and Mind Center, and I had a large university research grant from the Johnny Fetzer Foundation. And I was working 18 hours a day and then trying to go to the gym for a couple hours. And I just didn't have time to read. So buying books really was stupid. But so we go to the Hong Kong restaurant, and afterwards, Tom says, oh, well, you can just look. Okay, I'll just look. So the books are barcoded, no prices. And I'm walking down the aisles, and I had the idea, well, maybe I'll take these up and I'll ask the clerk to scan them, and maybe I'll buy 1 book. And so pretty soon I have my arms full of books. And I go, Tom, I can't carry any more books. We have to go. So we go up to the counter, and I dump all the books on the counter. And Tom distracts me with some interesting questions. Meanwhile, the clerk is scanning the books and so on. And then he says, well, that'll be, and he mentions some dollar figure. And I go into this strange state and I go, well, I wasn't actually planning to buy any of them, but if you'll give them all to me for, and I threw out some number, I said, I'll buy all of them if you give them to me for this price. And he goes, he had a little sort of a jerk, surprise, whatever. And then he said, fine. I continued my conversation with Tom. I gave him my credit card. He filled 2 large shopping bags with books, gave me my card back, and I walked out of the store. A few moments later, Tom came out and he goes, how did you do that? And I go, what do you mean? He goes, how did you do that? I said, Tom, I don't know what you're talking about. Tom said, that was the owner. He never gives anybody any discount. I saw you. You got all of those books for less than the price of the cheapest book. How did you do that? Oh my God. All of a sudden, I understood how J.H. had been able to do for IBM what he was able to do. And I also knew why he had to leave IBM. He was using his Delta powers to constrain people to be honest and ethical. The building contractors, of course, wanted to cheat. He wouldn't let them. It is a definition of evil to override another person's will, even if their will is to be evil and mean and cruel. If you use your Obi-Wan Kenobi powers to override the will of another person, that is evil. And so J.H. recognized what he was doing, and he was determined to stop it. He never went back to IBM, as far as I know. Now, a little side note, at one point at my training center in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, which is now in the process of being moved to Bray Creek, Alberta, Canada, I trained a woman who had delta waves. She had been terribly sexually abused as a child by a group of 6 men in the forest. So she had a lot of forgiveness to do. And she had a lot of anger, as you might imagine, from that experience. And she had delta waves. After this training in Canada, where she trained in Alpha 1, I left for Germany because I was leading the next training in my training center in southern Bavaria, just about 25 minutes from the Swiss border. And so she followed me and she did her Alpha 2. And the Delta was strong. Her job was, she was a fundraiser for charities. And she would go to presidents, she would make appointments with presidents, CEOs of companies, go in and give her pitch, and she would always leave with a large check. In many cases, a check so large that it would threaten the financial well-being of the company. How was she doing this? Why was she so successful? She had delta waves. And so in her job as a fundraiser, she was very effective in raising money. Well, when she left the Biocybernaut Center in Bavaria, she went to India to the Golden University, or the Oneness University. And the monks there were able to read in her energy field, not only that she had delta waves, but that she had been abusing them to fundraise for charities. And so she told me later, they took away her delta waves. This gives you an idea of the magic and the power of human consciousness and the importance of observing appropriate ethics. One additional story. I worked at one point with a Celtic master, an archdruid, who told me at one time, he said, Jim, you know, it takes me now forever to set up a work of magic. And I go, Robert, why is that? And he said, well, Jim, you don't know this, but he said he came into his powers as a young man of 19, and he would put spells on people and make them fall in love with him. and he abused people using his powers. The karmic consequences were such that he suffered greatly as an older man. And when he would do a work of magic, he would say he would now not any longer manipulate people, although he had the power to do so. He would manipulate things and objects and events. And so that, of course, would take longer than to manipulate people. And so there are great powers available through Delta. We do Delta trainings, but only by invitation only. We want to make sure people have done enough Alpha and Theta trainings to have done the forgiveness and the ethical cleansing before we give them these powers or give them access to these powers, because we don't want to create any Darth Vaders. Okay, the next person is MW, who trained in 05. And there you can see, not as big as JH, but you see some beautiful big delta waves on the frontals and a little bit of activity. There's some delta activity here and here on the centrals. Here he has a longer run of it. It's very beautiful. Delta waves, you can see the 1 second markers up here. And then we have PH. This guy was very interesting. He was from Australia. And he came in 05 to my training center in California. And here's the delta waves. I'll go one more. I measured the frequency here. It was 2.6 hertz. Now, typically, when I would see people who had delta, arrived with delta, I would ask them, are you aware of being able to influence other people? And he'd go, "Oi, mate," in his inimicable Italian or Australian accent. And I said, "Okay, well, give me the details." And he said, well, he ran a tree trimming business. And he would hire swarthy blokes, lower class, not very educated, very crude. And he had two problems with them. They would cuss and swear at the customers. And they would, at the end of the day, refuse to steam clean the equipment that they would use to grind up the limbs and branches. And the consequences of not steam cleaning the equipment at the end of the day are that the sap in the limbs and branches would harden like epoxy, and the equipment wouldn't work, and it would have to be painstakingly disassembled and then steam cleaned. Well, these macho workers considered cleaning women's work, and if they were to be caught cleaning, they would think of themselves as a fag. They would think of themselves as a homosexual because men don't do cleaning work. That's women's work. This was the problem that he had with the swarthy blokes he would hire to rip down trees for customers and grind them up. So I said, okay, well, you said you were able to influence other people. How would you do? He said, oh, well, I would go into a state and I would install my intention in the worker, and they would kind of like jump. And then for a while, they would follow my instructions. They would not cuss and swear at the customers, and they would steam clean the equipment at the end of the day. And I go, well, that's interesting. How long would that last? And he goes, oh, it's interesting you should ask, because sometimes it would last a couple of weeks, sometimes only a couple of days. And when they would snap out of it, they would immediately leave my employ, and I can't figure out why. And I go, wait a minute, come on. You're using a Jedi mind trick to force these macho workers to do something that they consider means that they are a fag, and they somehow blame it on you, and they find themselves doing it, and they're disgusted with themselves. And when they snap out of your mind spell, they want to get the heaven away from you, and you're puzzled about that? Come on. I said, now you have some really deep forgiveness work to do, because you have imposed your will, which is one definition of evil, on unwilling other people. And so he took this very seriously, and he did some major, major forgiveness. Now, you can see on this slide, Kundalini, a small truck. This is because when I would describe my Kundalini experience, I would tell people it was like a freight train of energy coming up my spine. And I had, oh, I should mention, one of the technicians was alert. at the polygraph. And when I had my Kundalini awakening, he flipped the polygraph into high speed. Normally it runs at 10 millimeters a second. He flipped it to 60 millimeters a second. It was like it was shooting the paper out. And so it spread out the brainwaves so we could very precisely calculate the frequency. I was producing 1.25 hertz slow delta, and it was maxing out. It was hitting the mechanical stops on the pens, but by extending the curves up using a French curve, we were estimating that it was coming up with a score of about 30,000. Now, that is 10 times bigger than, well, there are a few exceptions, but that's 10 times bigger than the best alpha that we normally see when people come for training. And it was way bigger than my alpha. So anyway, when I tell this guy that it felt like a freight train, he said, well, it was more like a small truck coming up his spine. So it wasn't as powerful an experience, apparently, as I had had. There you can see it's quite slow frequency, principally on the frontals and on the centrals. Frontal and central. And it's got reasonably good alpha running on at the same time. So nobody could suggest that, oh, he's sleeping in that stage 3, stage 4 sleep. Au contraire, monsieur, because these are very big, beautiful alpha waves. The guy is wide awake. He's making the delta of Kundalini. There's a kind of a mixed pattern, different amplitudes, different frequencies. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pause, reflect on this slide, and we're going to go into the last of the people whose delta brainwaves I'm going to show you. You can see here we have delta waves cruising through this guy's head. Beautiful, big, long, slow delta waves, and maybe some faster alpha. Okay, this is TDF, who also trained at my California center in 2005. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a little tutorial first. Brainwaves rule. Brainwaves rule your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, your perception. They rule your life. We know what your brainwaves are. We know what you're thinking and feeling. We know what you're perceiving. You can't have the perception of a color, red or blue or green, without having the brainwaves for red or blue or green operating in your visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Okay, so this is how a teenager would say it, brainwaves rule. How do we say this scientifically? Well, we refer to the psychophysiological principle. Psyche is mind and physio is body. Here it is. Any experience you have as a living being, you have only when you have a certain pattern of brainwaves. If you change your brainwaves, you change your experiences and you change fundamentally who you are at an identity level. This, of course, is the essence of transformation. I was able to show all the way back in 1978 in a publication in the premier science journal, Science, a publication of the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. Its only peer in the world is the British journal Nature. And so I published a paper there in 1978 demonstrating that the Biocybernaut alpha brainwave training would profoundly reduce both types of anxiety in high anxiety people. The two types are state anxiety, which is anxiety of the moment, and trait anxiety, which is a long-term personality disposition. We could take people who were chronically, systemically anxious, and in a week have them be below average in anxiety. And as we were later to demonstrate in the federal grant, anxiety and aging intervention with EEG alpha feedback, funded by the United States National Institute of Mental Health, a 3-year grant, we did 6 and 12-month follow-ups, and we found that these benefits, beyond lasting, they get more powerful. You get more stronger benefits at 6 months after the training in terms of personality benefits, and at 12 months, it's even better. And this grant was run double blind, which is the gold standard in science. So now, how do we test this? In logic and rhetoric, there is a a rule called reductio ad absurdum to test the truthfulness of any proposition. Reductio ad absurdum, reduce it to the absurd, well, or the extreme. Well, what's the extreme? Well, I'm saying that your brainwaves determine your experiences. And so what happens if your brainwaves stop? That's certainly then extreme. And that happens to be the medical definition of death. And so, of course, you cease having the experiences of living human beings when you have flat brainwaves, because that's the medical definition of death. And so brainwaves rule. They rule all of your experiences, all of your skills, all of your abilities. Okay, now let's look at the brainwaves of TDF. Here you can see that he's got alpha waves and he's got big delta waves. You can see the 8 channels from the back of the head, occipital, top central, side temporal, front frontal. And you can see that they run on very, very powerfully. Very big amplitude. He was hitting amplitudes of over 3,000 on his delta. Very powerful. Now, there's a really cool story about TDF. On the first day, when we're looking at his polygraphs at the end of the session, I see his delta. And so I asked this question, which is standard whenever I see people come in with indigenous delta. I say, are you aware of being able to influence other people? And he like freaks out. He was trembling. And I calmed him down. And I said, you know, if it's too personal, you don't have to tell me, but it would really, really be helpful if you would tell me what's going on. And so then in halting terms at first, and then gradually with a little more confidence, he described that he had recently been a high-ranking minister in a European government. And because of his position in the government, high-ranking position, he became aware of schemes and plots and plans by the secret government. And he used his delta powers to foil them. This would be like what is now referred to as the deep state. And so he was foiling plots and plans of the secret government, the deep state, which has agendas like undermining the integrity of the European nation states. George Soros is funding immigration into Europe from Africa for this purpose. He stated this is to destabilize the European nation states. So anyway, TDF used his powers to foil these plots. Well, these people are not used to their plots and schemes, shall we say, gang after glee. They're used to their success because they're powerful. And so when 11 consecutive plots had failed to achieve the intended result, they did a high-level review, simply beginning by listing the names of all the people who knew anything about these plots, even if it was just the name. Well, TDF's name was the only name that came up on all 11 lists. And so they knew they had their man. And so with a spokesman and 2 hired assassins, they barged into his office in this European government and said, we're on to you and we're going to kill you. But you have one chance to live, and that is if you join us and use your obvious powers to help us do what we want to do. And TDF's ethics were such that he said, no, there's a third option. And then he went deep and he gathered his delta energy and he blasted at them saying, I was a third option. I will resign from government and you will leave me alone. And they got it. They trembled and they filed out of his office. And he, due to his word, retired from government and was living as a private citizen. And shortly after that, he came to Biocybernaut in California for training. And so because of his very high ethics, he's the only person to whom I have ever given a delta training who had not done multiple alpha and multiple theta trainings. And I'll give you a little sneak preview of what his delta training was like. he went into a delta state, and in his mind, he would go out into the world and he would find evil people living in darkness. Now, observing the rule not to mess with somebody else's intention, let's say that there was a Mexican drug lord, a big fat drug lord, waddling down an alley, going off to give an order to have 13 Mexican policemen beheaded. And while he's waddling down the alley, a little kitty runs out from behind a rain barrel. And if he just keeps his ponderous stride, he's going to step on the kitty and crush it to death. If he makes a little effort to extend or pull back his stride, he can spare the kitty's life. Well, what Tdf was able to do was he was able to see that each one of these people living in darkness had light within them. We all have light within us. It's not our light, it's the light. But they couldn't see their light. And so what Tdf did was he adjusted the frequency of the light of these bad people a little bit so they could now see their light. So if the Mexican drug dealer stepped on the kitty and crushed it to death, he would see his light dim, and he would have, guess what? Feedback, worship word in Biocybernaut. He would have feedback about the consequences of his actions. On the other hand, if he would make a little effort and spare the kitty's life, he would see his light brighten. And again, he would have feedback. And so I am in awe of Tdf's abilities and also his morality, because he went right up to the line where he was adjusting the light within people so that they could see in the light the consequences of their actions. And hopefully over time, that installation or that awakening of their conscience would lead to, shall we say, better behavior. Anyway, that's just one of the things that you can do with delta waves. And here Tdf's delta waves are pouring out absolutely beautiful long runs. He also would have sometimes a whole body shake when he would go into the Kundalini. And look at here, the delta waves are fast, and here they're slow. So he's running delta waves in quite a large frequency range. Okay, now we remember that the Biocybernaut logo is a torus, which reminds us of the brainwaves of Halo. We've just now concluded the talk on Kundalini, the brainwaves of Kundalini. Remember, we have this amazing, powerful evolutionary energy coming up the spine, awakening each of the chakras. And when it hits the crown chakra, it bursts into superconscious awareness, which in the Buddha is symbolized by 1,000 petals, the 1,000-petaled lotus crowning the head. All right, so Kundalini, the brainwaves of awakening. And of course, we can use the cartography of consciousness to create partial differential psychophysiological surfaces for mapping and altering human mind states. And we can win this quest, which in this case is to awaken the Kundalini energy in more and more humans so that we can use this incredible energy for creation and manifestation and literally altering, well, as a physicist, I would say, we can alter the quantum mechanical probability energy density function of the local universe in which we are using the energy of Kundalini. Again, we can alter the quantum mechanical probability energy density of the local universe, which means we can make things appear and disappear, and we can alter things as we intend. Hopefully, prayerfully, we do this with very high ethics and with love in our hearts and delta waves in our brains. Thank you so much for attending. Many blessings.